let me put the view on full screen. So can you all see it? I guess so. I'm looking through the video. Okay, awesome. So my name is Henrique. I am an assistant professor at ISEG. I'm an economist. I'm going to discuss for the first time, actually, the second project of a broader research agenda I'm developing in Cabo Delgado. I started this still at Brown when I was doing the PhD. I'm continuing it now from ISEG. This is a project supported by the International Growth Center, so UK8, the JPAL at MIT, and the United Nations through Uniwider. The title is Winning the Hearts and Minds Through Dialogue, and this is basically trying to understand what the role that intergroup dialogue between IDPs in Pemba and local hosts can play in countering extremist tendencies and preventing conflict. So let me start with a very broad motivation. So basically, violent extremism, so insurgent groups, non-government armed groups are growing around the world. 48% of all terrorism-related deaths have occurred in sub-Saharan Africa, according to a latest report from UNDP. And from this figure here, well, although these are terrorism-related deaths, not insurgencies or number of attacks, we can already see that, you see a pattern in sub-Saharan Africa that you don't see somewhere else in the globe. Of course, given this spike in armed groups and in violence and insurgencies, there has been some substantial attention devoted by academics and to try to understand what can be done to prevent conflict. And this goes a lot to all this literature more on the political science side of the winning the hearts and minds of people through investments in infrastructure, through investments in cash transfers, job assistance programs, brick and mortar solutions. So solutions that are resource intensive and require some significant level of central planning with all the issues that the previous presentations, even today, already detailed. Well, also one of the main concerns, regardless of whether these top-down resource-focused interventions work or not, is whether they can actually be implemented. And in many contexts, they may actually not be able to be implemented, either because governments and international partners in lower income settings in the global south lack those financial resources, or just because conflict does not allow for governments and international partners to access. So the other option that has also been discussed extensively in today's workshop is to take community-based approaches. And I always start with this introduction because usually when I have to sell this to economists, I have to really explain that working with communities might be better than just dumping money in this context. So, but I guess that from all the previous presentations, I think we are all kind of in the same tune already. But yeah, community-based programs have some advantages. They allow people, they empower people, the local communities, to drive interventions. This allows tailoring the response that is being provided to the specificities of each context, and they can be implemented when more resource-intensive options are not available. Despite all these, impact evaluations on whether community-based programs are successful or not are still very scarce. So very broadly, the research question I'm looking with this project is whether community dialogue, in this case between IDPs and hosts, can reduce support for violence in conflict-ridden areas. For that, I run a field experiment studying the role studying the counterinsurgency role of intergroup dialogue that joined IDPs and hosts in Pemba. So, as Sylvia already mentioned, we have this insurgency going on in the region since 2017. It plagued the entire province. It caused almost one half of the population, almost one half in displaced. And a substantial place where IDPs went was the provincial capital of Pemba. There are some other, resettlement camps and some other minor towns that also got a substantial influx of IDPs, but Pemba is kind of one of the primary places. So the project looks at a program of 4 sequenced and structured community meetings that joined these hosts and the IDPs. This goes along theory in social psychology, namely the Allport contact hypothesis, that, if you want to summarize this in one sentence, we can say that according to the hypothesis, under appropriate conditions, intergroup contact can decrease the prejudice between majority and minority groups and build social cohesion. This meetings protocol was developed by me in collaboration with the local community. But I did not create the framework that was used. This comes from something called the public dialogue, developed by an NGO in the early 2000s and tested a little bit in different contexts around the world. And the idea was that, okay, I brought the framework, but then the community chose how to apply the framework to the context of Pemba, choosing what to discuss, how to discuss, when to discuss each thing. So, really everything that is being discussed in these meetings was chosen by the community. This also follows my previous work. So what was my main paper in my PhD dissertation that was just published earlier this year at the Journal of Development Economics that evaluated, it was like a pilot, just testing a very low touch, single community meeting between these IDPs and hosts. And at the time, the focus was really, to bring the IDPs and the hosts together through dialogue and see if discrimination decreases, if integration improves, if tolerance from the hosts towards the IDPs also improves. And it was very successful up to the point that the government wants to, learn how to do this now and to roll out it somehow. But at the same time, we also started to do some early measurements on whether this intervention was effective in improving religious tolerance, in changing the beliefs and perspective of the respondents towards the insurgency and the insurgents. And we observed that there was some effects then. So after we decided to rerun the intervention, making it more robust, not a one single meeting, but a program of 4 community meetings, each one with its own topic that I will detail in a few minutes. And yes, this is how this paper, this new project comes up. So let's go to the research design and methodology. So here we have Mozambique, one of the poorest countries in the world, and within Mozambique, Cabo Delgado, one of the poorest regions, provinces in the country, as far as Niassa, basically. So, and you can see that it's actually the GDP per capita in Cabo Delgado is half of what you have at the national average, which is already very, very low. So we are in a very underserved setting. Here in this map, we can see the districts of Cabo Delgado. The darker the color of the district, the greater the incidence of the insurgency measured by the number of attacks recorded by ACLED at the onset of the project. And basically, the pattern of the displacement is these IDPs coming from the most attacked neighbor districts in the north coast of the province, and they go to the south and to districts with less number of attacks, and namely to Pemba. This is how Pemba looks like, looking from a satellite view. So this is just basically a section cut from Google Maps. And this is just to show you that, Pemba is not a super dense city. You have the houses. They have like these backyards that are these, where you can see the dirt, all these orange/brownish empty land. And this is where you would find most of the IDPs, in the backyard of someone. So anywhere where there is free space. And you could also, they could also build small resettlement camps within the city, as this one that existed in the neighborhood of Maringanha, right in front of the houses of all the humanitarian workers. So one of the things that I started by doing, even before the intervention, was to run a baseline survey and to understand how exposed these locals were to the IDPs. And in fact, most of the locals say that they interact with they have some sort of baseline contact with IDPs, like they interact, 77% of them interact every day, as reported by them. And when we look in panel B on the right, on the hosts that the locals that are hosting the IDPs, we see that 54% is actually reporting that they are currently hosting IDPs, and 28% says that they are not hosting, but they have hosted before. So, you know, there is some level of contact, which does not mean that they are necessarily engaging on sensitive issues or having deep conversations or having, you know, a dialogue conducive of building social cohesion or something like that. Regarding the IDPs, there was some substantial heterogeneity between their exposure to the conflict. And this was something that surprised me when I arrived for the first time in Pemba. So I had that idea that, you know, all IDPs were, you know, all exposed to the things that insurgents did. They were in villages that were attacked by the insurgents, but in fact, not all of them saw the conflict. So we have 73% of them that were reported they were forced to leave their home versus left voluntarily. So yes, a large majority says they were forced to leave, either by the insurgents, either by government authorities forcing people to evacuate villages. Then when we go to exactly knowing someone that was affected by the insurgency, so for example, someone that was abducted by the insurgents, which is something that unfortunately happens, it's a common practice by Al-Shabaab. We have 44% that says that they know someone, at least one person that was abducted by the insurgents. So more than half of them actually do not know someone that suffered this. And if you restrict to people that says that in their household, at least one household member left the household because of the insurgents, and then we dig a bit more, and this could include, you know, a household member having been abducted or even killed by the insurgents. We have 29% of our IDP sample saying that this happened within their households. So after this, we also asked some questions about attitudes to the locals and the IDPs. So the lighter columns are the answers of the IDPs. The darker columns are the answers of the locals. And, you know, in general, you see very similar answers. So if you ask locals and IDPs if they support freedom of religion or if they preferred as an alternative that their religion was the only one allowed, you see that 73% answers that they support freedom of religion. Then there are some differences in the support of pardoning the insurgents. So this project was conducted at a time where the political discourse was all about reconciliation, which was, you know, as we came to understand by measuring these data, not totally aligned with what the population wanted. But still, even within our sample, we see differences between the locals and the IDPs. So the locals are less interested or support less pardoning the insurgents that seek for forgiveness, 39% versus 44% for the IDPs. Then we also have very similar levels of belief that, you know, violence may never be justified. And then we also have a small difference or some more substantial difference, I would say, between locals and IDPs on how to end the insurgency. So you have IDPs supporting less the government ending the insurgency using a military solution, while the locals support it more. And when you interpret these descriptive statistics with the one on supporting pardoning the insurgents, it's actually interesting because the population that is more subject was more directly exposed to the conflict, so the IDPs, are the ones that are more in favor of support at baseline of pardoning the insurgents that ask for forgiveness, and the ones that prefer a negotiated solution to the insurgency instead of a military one. And this, in part, could be related to the fact that, you know, IDPs are really very heterogeneous. You have those that were directly exposed to the insurgents, so they were in villages that were directly attacked, and you know, the things that happen, as you can imagine, are horrible, and those have different beliefs. And then you have all others that never saw the insurgents with their own eyes and have a different view on the conflict. So Going now to the intervention. So we have these 4 community meetings every 2 months. Each meeting has a topic. The meetings include 10 to 12 people with targeting an even mix between locals and IDPs. And they are facilitated by religious leaders from the Islamic Council of Cabo Delgado. So even before this project, in my earlier project, my initial question when I was suggested to use religious leaders from the Islamic Council was whether the Christian minority would actually respect these Islamic leaders. And I talked to Christian leaders, to the political officials, and etc. And everyone said that these Islamic leaders were very respected across the city, because they also resolved disputes that went beyond religion. So, and it actually worked very well in the initial project and in this project. So the topics covered in the first meeting was the experience of displacement and the experience being settled in the host neighborhoods, and the experience of hosts dealing with IDPs. And in this meeting, the IDPs also told their stories of what happened in their communities. For those that were in communities that were directly targeted by the insurgents. The second meeting used an exercise on prejudice and stereotypes to deconstruct stereotypes that existed between locals and IDPs. The third was focused on religion, so Islam, radicalization, and peace. And we leverage, in this case, the religious leaders to focus on verses from the Al-Quran, and focus on religious scripture, and discuss discuss Islam as a religion of peace. And the fourth meeting, the last one, was more focused on hope, forgiveness, aspirations, reconciliation, and the future. At the end of the presentation, I'm gonna give you the link for the paper, and in the working paper, you have the protocols of all the meetings, and you can see exactly how the script was for each of the meetings. So this is how a community meeting looked like. So usually it would happen in the courtyard or in the backyard of some house, somewhere in the center of the neighborhood. And this is how it's typically, the typical format, like they are in the private area, no neighbors listening. So we tell participants also this is going to be a private discussion. We sit people around a circle. So yeah, this is the typical design. Now, I don't want to spend too much time now in the theoretical framework here, but what I'm doing here is to go get some theory from social psychology and political science on de-radicalization and the psychology of de-radicalization and apply it here. So basically deconstructing preconceiving beliefs by putting people in contact with new contexts and new ideas. Also the aspirations as an economic mechanism of changing the incentives of engaging or supporting the conflicts. If you have better aspirations, your opportunity cost of engaging with the conflict will also be higher. So it's how it was, how the intervention was anchored. In terms of the research design per se, this is how it worked. So we worked in 10 neighborhoods within the city, and in each neighborhood we replicated this design. So we started by getting a random sample of the IDPs and the hosts. For the IDPs, we were lucky enough that IOM shared with us something called the Displacement Tracking Matrix, the DTM, which is the nominal list of all IDPs in Pemba by neighborhoods. And we basically were able to randomize from the entire universe of IDPs our samples. We got basically a super clean random sample of IDPs. For the locals, unfortunately, we did not have any updated census. So we use the method of random walks, which consists of people departing in different directions, our enumerators departing in different directions from the center of the neighborhood, and randomizing the households in which they stop and the people that are invited to participate in the study. So after this selection, people are randomly allocated to a treatment group in which they will be part of this program for the entire year, so the 4 community meetings. Or they can be randomly allocated to a control group in which they will just answer survey questions and participate in our data collection. And in that sense, our treatment ends up being a bundle, right? It's the bundle of engaging with the protocol of the community meeting, so engaging with these the content of the meetings, but also the component of engaging with the other members of the different group and of their own group. So just the fact that IDPs and locals are interactive. So in that sense, it's a bundle. So right after that, we got a baseline survey. Right after baseline survey, we get first meeting. Around 2 months after, so an average of 50 days, 58 days, 60 days, etc., we then collected follow-up effects. So every effect for every meeting that we are measuring happened 2 months after. This was to try to avoid or to reduce experimenter demand issues that people just answer what we want to hear, which is still a concern, but we did the best we could to try to minimize that. And we did that, we followed this pattern every 2 months. In terms of empirical specification, I'm basically estimating dynamic treatment effects. The regression is right here. So I'm trying to isolate the individual effect of each community meeting compared to the baseline before the first meeting. I introduce all technical aspects regarding standard errors, clustering of standard errors, fixed effects, this and that. Now, in terms of outcomes, so how do you measure attitudes towards the insurgency and how you measure conflict prevention? So in this context, as you can imagine, we cannot ask people, are you an insurgent, or do you like insurgents, or what do you think of Al-Shabaab? It's quite dangerous for everyone. So we need to come with alternative measurements. None of them is perfect, but in the context where we operated was the best we could do, especially because in our sample, we also had people that we were highly confident to be insurgents. So we had to be very careful navigating in this ground. So the best we could do was using a mix of survey questions. This was to measure, religious tolerance, very broadly support for the insurgency, not asking directly if people are insurgents, but asking attitudes towards insurgency versus some other option. So basically putting it in terms of policy preferences and reconciliation. And then we use two more unorthodox methods for collecting information. One is a graphical list experiment, which is an updated version of a list experiment that I created for this project. And it's basically a way of extracting the information from the respondents without us observing exactly what the respondent says, and in that way removes or minimizes issues of social desirability, of people being concerned that they have to answer what we want to hear. And in this presentation, I don't have too much time to go on how these outcomes were measured exactly, but if in the Q&A, if you have questions, I'm happy to answer, and I will show here in the slides. The other one is an image-based implicit association test, and this is a classical tool from psychology that I borrowed from there, and that measures implicit biases that individuals may have towards some group versus others. So our groups were, measuring whether respondents were more biased towards insurgents versus government, or etc., or the opposite, I mean. And I can go back to these, how these outcomes were measured later on in the Q&A. So jumping very quickly to the results. So as I told you, this is very, very fresh. I'm still digesting the results, and this will be a very raw interpretation of what I'm observing. So everything here are coefficient plots. They are treatment effects compared to comparing the individuals in the treatment group to the individuals in the control group. If we have a confidence interval, so one of these lines that is above the dashed line, then we have a significant effect. So significant at the 10% level, confidence level. Then we have the several outcomes. So we have 5 outcomes, and then we have an index that pulls all these outcomes in column 6. And then for each of the outcomes, we have the effects of the first meeting, of the second meeting, of the third meeting, and the fourth meeting. In this slide, we look at the locals. What we observe for the locals is that most of the significant effects actually occurred after the third meeting in yellow. So the meeting about Islam, peace, and radicalization. So you see more religious tolerance in column 1 improving. You see, well, you actually see less preference for reconciliation. After this third meeting, you see a big effect on preference against insurgents. And then when you pull everything and look at column 6, when you pull all the outcomes and take an index of all these measurements, you see that you have a large effect in the third meeting. You also see a large effect in the second meeting on prejudice reduction, and this is more driven by the improvement in religious tolerance that you see in column 1, and the preference against insurgents measured by the implicit association test in column 4. Now, there is a lot of heterogeneity in these effects. I just don't have time in the 20 minutes to cover this. This will depend a lot on whether locals had prior exposure to IDPs, whether locals were Muslims, on a bunch of different dimensions that I address in the paper. But for the sake of the presentation, I just cannot dig into it right now. For the IDPs, the results are much more mixed. So if we look at the entire sample of IDPs, we don't see many things going on here. We see an improvement in the preference against insurgents after the first meeting, where they discuss social integration in neighborhoods. And this is basically the significant effect you observe when you look at the outcomes individually. When you pull them into an index, you actually can see that the intervention was consistently effective in decreasing the preference or improving the preference of IDPs against the insurgents as measured in column 6. And the coefficients are, the coefficient sizes, so the estimates are relatively stable across time. There is this intriguing lack of effect after the third meeting that I'm still, trying to understand by looking at mechanisms, but I don't have a theory yet for that, or an informed explanation for that at this stage. But the other point is that all these results for the IDPs are really, really heterogeneous. So when you look at the IDPs that were not exposed to the insurgency, that's where you see the biggest results. And if you see, and these are the IDPs that they moved away from their villages, but they never got to see the insurgency firsthand, and where there can exist suspicions of some sympathies for the insurgents, or more likelihood of being seduced by the insurgents that come from their communities. So possible mechanisms, very preliminary, still work in progress. So I'm not showing even any graphs or coefficients here. One, religion. We see stronger treatment effects when we restrict the sample to Muslims. So there could be a religion channel here. This does not mean that there does not exist, an economic mechanism of economic inequality or absolute poverty mechanism going on here too. But at least religion seems to be one of them. Then there is possibly an information mechanism. We observe stronger treatment effects among these locals without a prior exposure to IDPs, or IDPs without exposure to conflict. And there can also exist, preliminary evidence also suggests some stronger effects related to social integration. So IDPs that felt less integrated at baseline are those that also show better results in conflict prevention and in the attitudes towards insurgents. And this could be related to the social integration and the sensing shifting with the opportunity cost of engaging with the conflict. People now feel better integrated, so they will have to give up more on their lives if they would like to have sympathies or align with the insurgents. In terms of policy implications, and to summarize this preliminary evidence from this project, this project for now brings evidence that non-material interventions can reduce extremist support in the context of low state capacity. We have in this project a framework that can be applied to de-radicalization and social cohesion in other contexts that go beyond Mozambique. So there's nothing here in the framework that restricts the analysis only to Mozambique, could be eventually replicated in other settings. It can be then scalable via either religious leaders to facilitate the discussions or local community leaders. And the use of local community leaders, it's something I'm testing now in another project with returnees. The reason why I am now in Cabo Delgado. So that's I'm trying to understand whether we can rely on other type of influential figures beyond religious leaders, because religious leaders are scarce, is a scarce group. So it cannot, there is a limit on the capacity to scale these interventions if you rely only on religious leaders. And then I'm also collaborating now with the government of Mozambique, multiple agencies and ministries, to complement these interventions into other programs that they are developing and coordinating with international partners. In terms of academic contribution, this is the first RCT evaluating religiously framed dialogue against an Islamist insurgency and combining implicit association tests and other measurements to make this evaluation. And for next steps, I'm working on disentangling these mechanisms. I'm measuring spillovers. So people go to the meetings, but nothing stops them from talking to people that were in the control group. And then we have contamination, and that can affect the effects. Still, if we come from the prior that the intervention was positive, a spillover from treatment to control group would only make the estimates that I'm presenting here conservative estimates, because it would inflate the results of the control group. And then I'm also very concerned about the issues about experimenter demand and social desirability issues, and whether that could be biasing the effects I'm estimating. So I'm trying to go around that. Follow-up research agenda. So this is why I'm here right now. So there is a request from the government. They want to learn how to run this intervention. So we are preparing a workshop with my main sponsor here in Mozambique to capacitate these officials and the community leaders how to scale this up. And then I'm working now with returnee communities in several districts, rural districts of Cabo Delgado, and rebuilding social cohesion in this context, where now the issue is really, people go back, but then their villages were attacked in first place because typically someone within the community denounced that there was something valuable in the community, food, etc. So when people go back, they suspect from their neighbors, there is a lack of social cohesion, there is mistrust. People go back and there is competition for scarcer resources. Land property rights are not well defined, namely mashamba, so the crops, who owns the crop is not well defined, and there are disputes about that. There are governance issues. Our new intervention is trying to bring a community-based solution to see if it can bring social cohesion to the returnee communities. So finally, thank you very much. I always like to acknowledge my fantastic team. So you can't imagine how difficult it is to collect this data in Pemba, given the context, and collect from a sample of 1,000 people in 10 different neighborhoods. This was only possible because of this great team of a coordinator and my enumerators that still are working with me. So I always like to acknowledge them. I leave you the QR code with the paper. Yeah, you have my contacts, and please feel free to reach out. Thank you very much.